morning to our students. Dumelan, hello. It's good to have you here again. And to our online audience, welcome and thank you so much for joining. This is our third talk in our series, Global Change Biology. 2 weeks ago, we discussed about invasive species, and today we're going to discuss something interesting as well. We're going to discuss the environmental change and its impact on freshwater ecosystems in Okavango and Botswana. The Okavango Delta is a unique and vital ecosystem facing growing threats. And tonight we're very lucky and very privileged to have 3 top scientists who will share their knowledge to help us understand. Before I introduce them, I would like to share with you some learning outcomes. Okay, so what are you going to learn today? By the end of this talk, you should be able to, 1, understand the ecological and global importance of the Okavango Delta. 2, recognize the diversity and ecological roles of fish in the Delta. 3, analyze the impact of environmental and human-induced changes on the aquatic ecosystems. And number 4, gain awareness of fish parasitology and its relevance to the conservation. So who are our speakers today? Today we have, from my left, Professor Paul Skelton, and then Professor Albert Chakona. Then to my right, we have Professor Russo Van E. So now I'm going to ask you to help me welcome our first speaker, Professor Paul Skelton, a fish expert who has studied the Delta for over 50 years. Guys, over 50 years. That's not a joke. Professor Paul Skelton, welcome to the screen.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm in one of my favorite places this morning, and certainly Botswana is one of my favorite countries, without doubt. I have been involved in that part of the world since 1975 or thereabouts, and it's been a wonderful journey. And I'm going to take you through what I call the living jewel of the Kalahari. And you'll see my question tonight or today, this morning, is to be or not to be. The question, of course, relates to its future, relates to whether we want this particular treasure or not. It's up to us. It's up to humans to make that choice. So the Okavango Delta is a jewel in the African landscape. It stands out from space. You can see the diamond there. Most of you know where it is, of course. And the little map on the side of my screen there shows that it's very close to the northern boundary of the country Botswana. And its origins are in Angola. It's involved with Namibia. And there are other countries like Zambia and Zimbabwe that are also pretty close to the scene of this action. So that's where we are, and it's nice to put it into this geographical perspective, because if you don't do that, you don't understand just what a jewel it is and what a treasure it is that we would be missing if it disappeared. So if we look at Southern Africa, that same landscape that I showed you there in one perspective, and we just drew cross sections across it at various points, you'll see that it's a very elevated landscape. The interior of Southern Africa actually is very high in almost every respect. It's very high in a continental respect compared to other continents. But even in Africa, this interior plateau with fairly narrow coastal zones. It's a remnant of Gondwana land, and the margins are what we call passive margins. In other words, the other continents broke away from Southern Africa, from Africa, leaving if you have a look at those transects, a rift valley, one side of a rift valley, elevated mountain zones, and then a vast interior, fairly level plateau. And over time, there's been erosion in certain places, some in more than others, and those erosional features of deep valleys, sometimes themselves parts of rifting or faulting, and the other side of that is like the Limpopo Valley, a very ancient fragment or weakness in the crust where the elements have taken advantage over a long period of time. One of the big features of the interior is this vast sand deposit, the Kalahari sands, and the Okavango Delta there, you can see in the green, actually sits in the middle of these sands. These sands are deep in places and shallow in other places. They are a product of Africa itself over time, but they reflect a period of desertification that took place some 7-8 million years ago in the Miocene. And there was a very nice paper that explained this, that at one time, this particular desert was actually bigger than the Sahara Desert is today. So it's a really interesting feature, and more than interesting, it left its impact on all sorts of things, such as, the landscape itself, the formation of the rivers, and the fauna. So if we look at, and I'm not going to talk too much about the fishes because that's going to be to Albert Chakano, who follows me. But here are two examples of the impact of that desertification on some fish faunas. Both of these examples are riverine. They like flowing, they like rivers. They don't like lakes so much, so they're streamlined. And if you look at their distributions in black, you'll see that it occurs in isolated fragments around this massive Kalahari sand, typical as though the connections between those black spaces have been eliminated over time by the desert, by the lack of water, and by the overwhelming nature of those sands. If we look at the structure, we will begin to understand why there is a delta where it is and so forth. And there are two diagrams here that help us explain why the delta exists where it does. On the one side, you see the ancient fractures of the blocks, the fundamental building blocks of the African landscape. And amongst other things, you'll see the framework for the African rift system. And that African rift system stretches from Ethiopia into two arms around the western arm, where we get these high mountains on the eastern side of the Congo. And on the other side, we get the rift that forms certain lakes in Tanzania and in Kenya and so forth. And in the middle, you get this Great Lake Victoria, balanced, as it were, between the rifts. And then you get, coming south, the rift into Tanganyika, the greatest, deepest lake in Africa, and then into Rukwa and Lake Malawi, down into Mozambique and off into the Indian Ocean. And then coming from there, there's an older rift even, and this is an ancient one, the Luangwa River. And the recent African rift fractured that. It actually used to stretch right into Tanzania. And it comes across and forms a part of the middle Zambezi Valley today. And then there's another branch you'll see that is proposed by the authors Daly et al. In 2020 as an extension of this great African rift. They're not sure if it's still extending. Some geomorphologists don't follow that particular line. They say that that line, that rifting, belongs more to the ancient side of the rift than it does to the modern rift. And then on the right-hand side of my diagram, it's very nice indications of swellings and rifting. And in the middle, you'll see the Okavango Delta as part of the rifting. And around the edges of where the Kalahari sands, there are swells. They are up. The landscape is brought into swells and holds it like a basin almost. So the geomorphologists give us a lovely framework for understanding the Okavango Delta and its formation. Then there's another thing that comes out about this wonderful delta. It's actually formed in part of what was called an ancient lake, a Paleo-Lake. And the Paleo-Lake is framework there, Magadigadi Bank, all this great shading there, and it comes through the Okavango, right through to the Chobe Valley, and then into the eastern floodplains of the Zambezi and so forth. And this is an alluvial fan. The Okavango is an alluvial fan between framework or buttressed, if you like, on either side by these riftings. And here it is nicely explained. There's a space photograph to show it. You can see the structural lines, even in the earth as it thing. There's Lake Ngami along the Tamalakani on that side, and then where it breaks out after the panhandle, the other side. There it is in diagrammatic form, and here it is to show how this rifting has formed a little basin, and it's level today, but it's sandy. And that's why it ends at this point, and it spreads out at that point. It's an alluvial fan. And there is a nice framework of this Palaeo-Lake Magadigadi, as it's called. And those who study the distribution of organisms and fishes and so forth have speculated on how the rivers flowed at these various points and how they have been affected by various geomorphological features, such as that rifting that I told you about. And I'm not going to go too much into the details here, but it does show that at one stage, the Limpopo was the major outlet. And the bulge in this is old in the African into the Indian Ocean of the Limpopo floodplain down here reflects that deltaic, a very big, very massive system that drained the interior, bigger than even the Zambezi is today. But that was fragmented by these upwellings later on in geohistory that formed the basin for which these Kalahari sands then deposited. Then you got these deflections and capture by the Zambezi of various components. The Kunene on one side also captured and the Limpopo, a fragment of what it once was, has been beheaded by these captures and by the swelling of the basin. And finally, that fragment, that the rifting that you called there, that I showed you earlier on, that formed this inland alluvial fan and separated from the Magadigadi pans over there. So all of that, we've got fish distributions that actually indicate all of those previous things. One of the things I'll just mention, of course, is that one of the outcomes of having a mega paleo lake in that area, just as we've got in Lake Malawi, Lake Tanganyika, Lake Kivu, Lake Victoria today, species flocks. In other words, they form arenas where these fish and other organisms can speciate because of the diversity of habitat that they present over a period of time. This mega lake in the middle of the Kalahari allowed certain fish groups to speciate. And here are two examples that scientists have studied. and shown that there is a radiation of certain large breams, the cichlid breams on the one side, and the cyanodontous squeakers on the other side. Some of you may be familiar with some of those organisms, but there are species flocks. In other words, there are a cluster of different species, some just mildly different from the others, that must have speciated and in that particular lake. It's also evident that the lakes were not terribly long-lived in geomorphological time, and some of those speciation events have not gone through to completion, and the species are not as distinct as they might be if the lakes were longer lived. So the functional delta, let's talk about that. On the left-hand side here, you've got the delta in a nice picture from one of the books that you can get on the delta. There's the panhandle, which is a permanent swamp. It's always flooded. It's where the river comes in, begins to meander, begin to lay its load down, and then where the rifting starts and it spreads out, and the sands that are deposited over time. And so up here, you've got in the darker blue, the permanent swamp where there is always water and lakes and lagoons and so forth. And then beyond that is the seasonal swamp. So when the floods come down, it floods a vast, this is a big area, places, and then of course the rivers and the sump lake down the bottom here, and the rivers that go up into the Magadigadi. And on the right-hand side, I show you a very important map. Very important because if we don't understand this, and we think that this delta exists in isolation, we are making a big mistake from its conservation, from understanding its dynamics and everything else. And that is that the source, the whole delta, depends upon its inflow. And its inflow consists of two major streams that join before coming in a single stream, the Okavango River. But up in its source, it consists of the Okavango stream on the west and the Quito-Quanabal, another type of stream on the eastern side. Now, understanding those streams and their nature is very important to understanding the nature of the delta and its future and its conservation problems. The Okavango on the one side is a fast flowing river on a rocky landscape. The underlying geology is rocky based, and so you get this river. So when it rains, the waters go into the river and it flows down fairly rapidly down into the lower reaches, into the delta and so forth. And there's just some scenes to give you what it's like higher up and in one or two of the tributaries in Angola. And then on the other side, the Quito-Quanabal, completely different ecological systems. These ones resting on Kalahari sand. So they're soft-bodied in nature. The source areas are on the side here, Quito and Quanabal lakes. Very swampy, slow draining. The waters, the rainfall falls, it seeps through the sands and slowly accumulates and then comes down the rivers. The rivers themselves are floodplains, like the delta itself. They, at dry season, maybe form a very slow flowing channel like this, meandering channel. But when it rains and that it soaks the water up like a sponge, and this would be what you would see at the height of the rainy season in those river valleys, swamps and slow flowing. So it soaks it up and then slowly releases it down into the channel as the dry season comes upon. So this very different nature that you've got feeding the delta forms its characteristic. Not only do you get a double peak, the one from the Okavango side where the waters flow off rapidly And you can see both on the water levels, you can see a double peak in all the flows over the years, but also in the discharge, you get that double peak. The one coming from the Okavango and the slower one being released and often higher than the Okavango. In other words, more water being released from the Quito Guadalajara. Very important dynamic that determines the nature of the delta itself. And here are a few images for those who haven't been, or those who haven't had the privilege of flying over or even visiting this wonderful wetland in the middle of what is the beginning of the Kalahari so-called desert. And on the left-hand side, you see the flood arriving in a very dry landscape. Those dark patches here are the floods just beginning to come. A little bit later on, those floods have broken free and submerged the landscape. You can still see animal tracks and tracks from the various pans and sources over the landscape. This is what it's like down when those floods arrive. Shallow, marshy, lots of plants and so forth. And here's a view of the flooded landscape. There you can see a channel from which the waters have spread wide into this wonderful delta, providing all sorts of habitat for plants, for animals, and for humans to enjoy the playground of nature in its own form. Here is Guma Lagoon, beautiful, large, permanent lagoon, large trees, riparian trees, fairly deep waters, several meters deep and so forth, and open water. Then you get the smaller lagoons, flooding, and with margins with plenty of vegetation and swamp-like nature. And other places right against the hard bank, and you get riparian trees and deep channels, deep with papyrus-lined channels flowing when the river comes and so forth. So a wide variety of landscapes in this wonderful thing. And then it goes through this delta and then gathers where the rifting has formed barriers. It can no longer just spread itself out and the rivers gather the water and drain it off. And here are a few scenes of the Tamalakani at the bottom with there was water in it. Then there's a picture of the Tamalakani at Maun when there's water in it. This is the river draining down into Lake Ngami. And again, in high flood times, water actually reaches the lake. And if they do, this is a scene you might see of flamingos as the lake fills up and then dries out slowly. So wonderful dynamics. This is a very, very dynamic system. It seldom stands still. It's always changing. It changes in strange ways. So one of it is the water arrives in the middle of the year, in the cool months. I was going to say winter, but I think that's a relative term for Botswana, in the cooler months of the year. And that is the time when nature takes a break, usually. It builds up its resources, and then when the warmer months come again, it explodes with breeding and growth of plants and things like that. So the water arrives at an awkward time for nature in many ways, when it least needs that. It's really in a resting stage. So it's a water system. It's an aquatic wetland, basically. And of course, you get lots of wetland animals. And because it's so big and whatnot, you get some aquatic, what I call denizens. You get the crocodiles, you get hippos, you even get lions in that thing. They become adapted to water, and they're not afraid, like many other lion populations in Africa, of water, or wary of water. They tend to just hunt and treat it as part of their playground. They have to. They have no options when it floods and that. And then there are abundant of other types of herbivores, predators, things like that. Now I'm showing you these obvious pretty pictures for another reason. A lot of people in the world like nature, like to see nature, like to visit nature, raw in tooth and claw, as they say. This is like an atavistic hunt of people, and particularly the Westerners who've lost this touch with nature. They're prepared to pay big money to come and see these beautiful animals in such a untamed environment, as it were. And of course, it goes on and on. It's such a vast area and such a wonderful, dynamic, productive area. The largest concentration of elephants in Africa. The bird life is just wonderful, beyond description for those who love it. And believe you me, there are lots of people who pay a lot of money to come and see these beautiful birds. Here's just another one to show you what they come and see. Unusual birds. Birds that you have to seek out. So for those lifers, and they spend lots of money to do this, they come because this place has more of those than most other places. And as a result of that, you get this wonderful development, if you like, in tune with that nature. These are lodges. Now, I'm showing you this in this presentation because we're talking about survival. We're talking about endurance. We're talking about value. If this delta just existed, Botswana might ask the question, well, we need the water. Let's just take that water off. Or we need the animals. Let's just shoot the animals out, etc. Well, if they did that, they would be cutting off an economic lifeline for the people of Botswana. And, of course, for the rest of the world to enjoy and be prepared to pay. So when you see this tremendous development in tourism and in tourist infrastructure, such as this, where people are prepared to pay many thousands of dollars a night, you realize its economic importance. Cut that delta off, stop it, and you're cutting off an economic flow of jobs and revenue for the country itself. Second to only, I believe, things like diamonds. So it is a very, very important thing. And to sustain this and to encourage it, to encourage Botswanans to support this in order and to support the ecosystem that allows this to happen is a vital part of the message that we've got. So anglers will come there and they will hunt various, not just your national fish, as I heard in your queries early on in the lecture, but many people are dependent on it. There's a picture I took of a man up in the rapids on the Okavango River in Angola, and he was out fishing me by miles. I was looking for that particular fish, which happens to be a labia barbus, it's a cyprinid, and this guy comes along with his bamboo and hook, and he says, there they are. And I say, wow, I knew they were there, but I didn't know they were there in such abundance. And then, of course, their lovely methods, their traditional methods, those baskets you see social activities of women, and then the more modern means of catching fish through gill nets and so forth. I'm just going to go back to this slide to make this point, that in many of these areas of rural Africa, and here I'm talking about the source areas of the Okavango, as well as the Okavango and its things, it's been impacted by modern society in many ways. But there are many parts of that system that are very, very difficult to get to. They're not yet open. They have not been opened up by modern means and so forth. And in these areas, subsistence is a way of life. If you destroy that subsistence, you destroy the existence of poor rural people, not inferior people. They just live off the land. And this is the way it's been for millennia. From time memorial, the people have lived off the land. They know how to catch. They do it seasonally. They do it. Kids are not working hard. They actually growing and learning the skills of life from their elders and so forth. And they all participate, and there's no conflict, and everything happens. They leave enough for the next generation, for the next year, and so forth. There's no over exploitation. It's a wonderful thing to see, but it's an ideal world that is fast disappearing. So the question becomes sustainability. How do we make sure that all of this benefits the people who need it most, and the country who needs it from an economical, from jobs, from development, and all that? There is a couple of pictures we took again up on the rivers showing an over-exploitation of those fish resorts. These pictures here show drying fishes in their thousands. They were caught by semi-commercial type of operation, if you like, where the people come in, they do gill nets, they take everything. Nothing for the locals, nothing for anybody else. They dry them, split them out, dry them, pack them off to the mines and so forth. There is an Okavango Wilderness Project showing the concentration of gill nets, of fishing nets. And you can see as you come down, it gets more and more. And along the exposed areas down here, Rundu and going in before Botswana, the number of gill nets far exceeds the carrying capacity of the river system to sustain this for year after year. And you're seeing as a result the fish resources disappearing. So the growing population of Africa and climate change, and that's also a human-induced phenomenon at this moment in time, are growing threats. Climate change, because we do not know whether you're going to get drought or floods or whatever in future. We know it's going to change. And the population, well, African population is growing faster than any other region on earth, any other continent on earth. And down this part of Southern Africa here, it's enormous. And it's beginning to take over the landscape. I flew up to KwaZulu-Natal 2 weeks ago, and I looked out my airplane window and took pictures, and I just saw in some places landscape covered with people, covered with things that were formerly healthy, natural environments in which water goes into the river unpolluted and so forth. Those rivers now are all polluted, all running away, erosion and so forth. Too many people on the land. So to bring this to a close, I'm going to talk about the various components of the delta and the threats and the possibilities that they face going forward. The one, of course, is the delta and its downstream reaches. Remember the dependency on this. This delta does not exist if it were not for the inflows in Angola. So Botswana better collaborate and work with Angola if it wants to sustain this dual. It cannot do it by itself. We have to become friends. We have to become collaborative partners with our neighboring countries. Likewise with Namibia as well, where the river and it crosses over. If Namibia decides it wants all the water and doesn't like Botswana, whatever it is, then this delta is doomed. Likewise with Angola. They build big dams and stop the water coming down and ignore that this is a system that needs to be managed for the benefit of all. But there has to be a give and take. So downstream here, there are many people, there are towns developing, agriculture is practiced, there's ecotourism, there's fishing, pollution, and water extraction. Fishing and overfishing, there's hunting, there's all sorts of things If you destroy that resource, if you don't manage it properly, that was the big threat. The Okavango River, there are also many people, town, agriculture, dams because it's a fast-flowing river, and water extraction. So that needs to be managed very well. And then this part of the country, on Kalahari Sand, not very good for agriculture, not very populated, very few towns, small towns, not very amenable for dams and so forth. This is a potential water tower. It is the water tower, as we saw in those flood diagrams that I showed you earlier on. Here is the possibility for real collaboration and conservation. And that is the plan that's been put forward by the scientists studying this system, beginning to understand the dynamics of this very complex system. So that's an introduction for you guys. And it is a message of hope. It's a message that this system still functions. It is a message of saying impacts are beginning, and we can see those impacts. And it takes a wise system of governance to ensure the future for this wonderful jewel of the Kalahari. Thank you very much.
Wow, Professor Paul, this was a very fascinating introduction. I haven't been to the Delta before, but it feels like I have the whole picture in my head and I can picturize everything. Thank you so much for this introduction. Yeah, so there is a question in the chat for you from Martin Jordan. Martin, would you please unmute and ask your question, or should I just read it out? Okay, I'll just read it out. She's asking, just interested, what percentage of the Delta is formally protected under the legislation? The percentage of the Delta that is formally protected under the legislation.
Thank you, Martin. I can't answer that precisely because I don't have that knowledge in hand, but I can tell you that not the full scope. In other words, there is the Moremi Reserve, and there are protected areas where there is very limited access, and you have to either be part of a lodge and going in and so forth. Even the cattle are restricted from being grazed. There's a buffalo fence that prevents them. I'm not 100% sure, but I can say this, that I think the Moremi Reserve and the Moremi Kwai, and that it's very remote, and it's under a form of protection that allows limited and only certain types of exploitation, lodges and things like that. But percentage-wise, I'm sorry, I can't answer that question.
Thank you so much, Prof. Dr. Richard, would you please check with the students if there is any question from that side? And right now we're going to take Menzi's question. Menzi, would you please unmute and ask your question?
Thank you very much, ma'am, and thank you very much, Prof, for the very informative lecture. I have actually 3 questions. My first question is that, are there any information spillovers for the ecotourism from the Delta, which might help the country to achieve some sustainable development goals, such as technological innovation? And also the second question is that, are there any invasive species that of course influence the loss of biodiversity in the Delta? And my third question is based on the Kubango, or Tubango, I do not know, the Kubango dams. Has government, or rather the people, considered hydroelectricity as a form of promoting clean energy and sustainability in the country? Thank you very much, ma'am, and thank you very much, Prof.
Thank you. I'm going to have to ask again for those questions. But the first one is, am I correct in saying you asked which countries do the tourists mainly come from? Is that correct?
No, Prof. I'm considering all the countries as all countries which come in as, or rather, we say the tourists which come from other countries. Now, are there any information spillovers for those tourists which are coming into the country, which might, of course, help to achieve some of the sustainable development goals, which include technological innovation?
Thank you, Liesl. There's definitely, there are a couple of things that happen with tourism. The one is the direct payments that these people make to the lodges, and then that flows, what they call a trickle down from the lodges into the community, with the lodges supporting employment, educational efforts, and things like that. So that's the one side of it. The other side is that many of these tourists go back and they've been sufficiently enthused and encouraged by what they see, and they wish then to contribute more directly. And then they might make big donations to things like the WWF or to various NGOs that are doing conservation and things like that. And I think that is a very real and possibly difficult to get a handle on, but it is one. And there is also the NGOs themselves. I should, I know of several that are active in this area, that are based, for example, in Mound. They set up establishments, they employ particularly qualified people, and they do all sorts of things towards conserving that environment by fighting both nationally and internationally for its existence and so forth. And the contributions of tourism to those sources is also a very real one. Now, I don't know if that answers your question, but all I can say is that awareness, public awareness of the value and the threats and whatnot to the system is a very important part of getting the conservation going. And certainly the treatment by locals of that resource is vital. The respect by everybody of the local dependency on that resource is equally vital. Okay, your second question, Stella, help me with that one, please.
The second one was on invasive species, but I think Albert is going to deal with that in his presentation. And then the last one was about, sorry, Menzi, if I'm taking over, I have a bit of a louder voice as well. Also, the last one was with the Okavango, if I understood you correctly, the high volume of the water in there, and then the use of shared electricity in the highlands and part of it.
Okay, yes. So the invasive species one, as you say, Albert will probably deal with that, but I can say that it's relatively, and it's a relative term, free from invasive species, but there is at least some anticipated species coming in. The Nile tilapia is one that is present up in Angola, not yet down into the lower reaches. And then, of course, the weeds, the aquatic weeds and diseases, and I imagine parasites and things that come with these particular ones. The outbreak of saprolegnia type fungus and so forth that affected a lot of the upper Zambezi side is also present there. I've witnessed that myself, but it has not yet had economic impact that it certainly had earlier on in the Zambian areas and so forth. So that's an ever-present threat. If we ignore, if we manage the system biologically with indifference, and we don't care and we don't put standards, we're threatening the system in the long term. So we need to manage that very carefully, and that is both an international, it's got to be an international as well as a national concern. It's no good Botswana managing its boundaries only. if Angola allows everything to happen, and likewise with Namibia. So it's a collective OCACOM responsibility to manage this system. And I would suggest very strongly that that body forms a particular wing of it to deal with things like alien invasors. Okay, and the third question, Liesl, you just repeat that quickly, please.
I think if I made my quick notice also of the use of electricity generation of the water, and then the influence of that on the system.
Yes. So there's very limited electro generation in the Okavango system taking place. There are some minor hydroelectric plants. There's one that I know at Andara, for example, but it's very small. And there are some planned up on the Kubango system where there are potential hydroelectric sites available. But as far as I'm aware, there is nothing of any substance at this point in time that one would worry about. Obviously, in future, if Botswana needs to draw from those hydroelectric sources, they would need to also contribute to the development of it. So that's a typical example of saying, I don't just take, I've also got to give, and it's a give and take. So.
Thank you so much, Prof. I think the invasive one will be answered by Professor Albert.